Today, Universal has 7 different theme parks around the world, with even more on the way. And none of this would have happened without the Universal Tram Tour at the original California studio. It's a fundamental part of Universal's identity that grew into groundbreaking attractions that propelled the company to the heights that you know today. And in my opinion, it's one of the best reasons to visit Universal Studios Hollywood. There's a lot in Hollywood that makes it worth visiting, from its attractions unique only to this park, to the general atmosphere and vibe, as one of the most geologically interesting parks built on the side of a mountain. But there's just something about boarding that tram and not only seeing the real studio and its history, but also encountering so many interesting show effects and scenes that makes this one of the world's most unique attractions. If you're lucky, you might even get a glimpse into actual production of television and film, and you might even pass by a celebrity walking the lot. The tram tour is dynamic and always changing, sometimes rerouting visitors due to actual filming, and sometimes adding or removing set pieces from the experience, meaning that it can often change quickly, even year to year. It occurred to me that the Universal Tram Tour has a long and fascinating history, and while I've covered it briefly before, because of how it's tied into the development of early Universal Studios Florida, I really wanted to produce a video that takes a more comprehensive look at what it has offered throughout the decades. That's not to say that I'll cover everything, as minor changes often occur and are not documented, but I wanted to take a closer look at some of the broader strokes of its history to really illustrate what makes it one of the coolest attractions to ever exist. History videos always take a lot of time and effort because so much research is involved. So if you'd like to support me, please leave a like on the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's take a ride on one of the most important attractions in theme park history. To understand the origin of the tram tour, we need to go back to Universal's founder, Carl Laemmle. He was born in 1867 in Laupheim, Germany. After a period of correspondence with his brother Joseph, who worked for a newspaper in Chicago, he immigrated to the United States in 1884 and arrived in New York City, taking a low-paying job at a drugstore just to survive. After a few weeks, he managed to contact his brother, who sent him money and a train ticket to Chicago, and from there, worked various odd jobs over the next decade. It wasn't until 1894 that he became the bookkeeper for the Continental Clothing Company in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which was his first big step into the world of business as he discovered his talent for bold and effective advertising. Quickly moving up into a management role, and after a decade with the company, Laemmle had saved a substantial sum of money and wanted to initially use the funds to start a retail chain. However, after experiencing his first Nickelodeon, a term for an indoor theater showing films for the price of a 5-cent nickel, he instead used his money to open his own theater in 1906, the White Front in Chicago, which was soon followed by another, named the Family Theater. In the earliest days of the film industry, it was difficult to find quality motion pictures, with manufacturers also being difficult to get into contact with, and often not delivering the films to theaters on time. By the end of his first year of operating, Laemmle opened his own film exchange to work as a reliable, quality third party between theaters and the film manufacturers, and within just 2 years, his company expanded across the eastern United States and became the largest film distributor in the country. In 1912, he founded the Universal Film Manufacturing Company along with other investors, but because the demands of production continued to rise as the industry developed, he moved film production first from Chicago to New York, and then in 1915, after buying out the other investors, settled his studio on a chicken farm in the San Fernando Valley, just outside of Los Angeles. This is where he founded Universal City, an actual municipality to support what quickly became the world's largest movie studio, and in order to generate positive brand recognition with the public, the studio would allow in visitors. For 25 cents, people were given a boxed chicken lunch and could view films as they were being produced, where they were often encouraged to cheer and boo for the heroes and villains. In the first year of operation, Universal produced over 250 films, so there was always something for audiences to see, as production was pretty much constant. In 1928, management of the studio was handed over to Laemmle's son, Carl Laemmle Jr., and as the film industry evolved to include sound, it became unfeasible to invite in tourists as their noise was disruptive. By 1930, studio admission had stopped, and the gates were closed to the public. As the American film industry became a cultural juggernaut, and with the post-World War II rise of the middle class, tourism picked up in the United States, and of course, what better destination than Hollywood? People came to see the stars in the studios among the warm Southern California climate, and in 1956, Gray Line bus tours introduced their Hollywood tour. The buses took tours through the Hollywood Hills to view the homes of celebrities, and after passing by other studios as part of the tour, were then allowed to drive through the Universal backlot to view many of the historic sets. It's a bit unclear when exactly this change occurred, but I believe that by 1959, the buses began to stop at the studio commissary so that tourists would buy lunch, which, to the surprise of studio executives, was quite profitable. With the success of the bus tours, and in the spirit of bringing back studio visitation from the earlier years, Universal invested in infrastructure like food courts, parking lots, and restrooms to accommodate tourists for a new attraction. In 1964, Universal Studios Hollywood, as they were now officially called, premiered striking candy-striped tram cars as the Glamour Trams, which for the price of $2.50 took visitors on a guided tour of the studio. The trams would drive through sets on the lower lot, which were often grouped into themes, such as facades designed to emulate New York City, an area that was used and dressed for scenes in Europe, and a depiction of rural Mexico. An interesting standout among the sets was the house from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, as well as the prop warehouse, where the tram would drive indoors, and visitors could view an eclectic collection of film props on display, showing how much work the prop department put into the movie-making process. The geographic variety of Southern California was also great for nature landscapes as well, which was something also highlighted on the route. Compared to the tram tour today, the sets were much more extensive and were always changing, even sometimes because fires would break out and burn down certain sections. While many of these have historic value, with many surviving even up through today, it can be difficult to really chronicle the development and history of the sets just because so much was changing all the time. Initially, the Glamour Trams were the only part of the tour, but according to the StudioTour.com, which chronicles the history of the park, within just that first year, the commissary basement introduced a few attractions as part of the experience. This included an exhibition of costumes by designer Edith Head, and a brief makeup demonstration, which was a small show designed by Bud Westmore, famous for many makeup effects, but I think is most notable for the creature from the Black Lagoon. There was also what is described as a push-button monster, which, lacking information, I assume may have to do with some rudimentary animated figure of Frankenstein's monster. Tourists would also leave the commissary and walk through Doris Day's dressing room, and finally, would watch two stuntmen teach an audience about how they performed action on a Western set. There was also a segment of the actual tram itself, where visitors would get off at the prop plaza, and could walk around a small part of the lot. Here, people could pick up giant foam boulders to make it appear as if they had incredible strength, and could sit in a rocking stagecoach, with a looping background simulating the idea that they were traveling through the Old West. I can't pinpoint whether the segment opened with the tour, but it was definitely there by at least 1965. This is also the year that Universal opened the Visitors Entertainment Center in the upper lot, which moved the commissary exhibitions to this area and allowed visitors to walk through various sets labeled as the Streets of the World. There were also some small demonstrations of special effects, including an artificial pond with miniatures of ships to teach visitors about how naval battles were shot. Another interesting effect was a painted mountain background with fake snow that could be triggered by the press of a button for a really neat demonstration of how weather is created for the camera. The Western-themed stunt show was moved to the new Action Arena, and that early animated monster, I believe, evolved into something called Papa Mustard's Laboratory, which was a short show with a very crude figure of Frankenstein's monster, which would be flipped on a table to face the audience and would have limited interaction with them. The show also had a flying bat effect, and Gilman would appear from behind a curtain of foliage in the swamp. In 1967, the Ma and Pa Kettle Farm, based on the hit film series, opened on the upper lot, allowing visitors to watch what the park called animal actors participating in demonstrations about how animals are trained for film. The early glamour trams and exhibitions of the Visitors Entertainment Center might appear humble compared to what the park grew into later, but this is a fascinating era that only continues to get more interesting. In 1968, Universal set itself on the course for greatness and added its first major special effects attraction to the glamour trams. In the process of driving through the Mexican village, the tram would stop for a special effects scene, where water would be sprayed over the tram to simulate the idea of rain. To the surprise of riders, 10,000 gallons of water would then come sliding down through the village in a scene known as the Flash Flood, splashing up dramatically at the tram and utilizing simple mechanical effects to move props in the village as if the water was sweeping them away. The entire scene can reset within 90 seconds, and audiences in the 1960s had never seen anything like this before, so I have to imagine that it was quite impressive for its time. While the effect is cool by itself, what it also did was evolve the tram tour into something more than just a tour of the sets, and Universal would continue adding more special effects scenes over the years. In 1970, the upper lot added the Animal Actors Training Stage, which evolved the original demonstrations into an actual show, and in 1971, the glamour trams added the Torpedo Run to the tour. This effect seems to be less well known, but the trams would drive by Park Lake, which was actually used for filming on movies like The Mississippi Gambler, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and even the television series Gilligan's Island. As visitors moved alongside the water, they would witness a submarine following the tram as the guide wondered if they were friend or foe, and this question would be answered as it launched a torpedo right at the tram. This effect was achieved using a mechanical underwater track, and an explosion effect would attempt to startle riders with the massive splash. In 1973, Park Lake also added the Parting of the Red Sea, an effect inspired by Paramount's The Ten Commandments. Essentially, the tram stopped at the end of the path, and the guide would talk about how they were parting the sea, which, utilizing a hidden drainage system, would allow the tram to drive through a trough for what must have been a very impressive technical effect of its time. The same year, the tour also added the Burning House, which illustrated how buildings on fire were shot for movie scenes using burning gas and fireproof building material. 1974 would add 2 additional effects, with the rock slide unleashing massive foam boulders to run down the hill as if they were going to hit the tram. The other effect was the collapsing bridge, where as the tram pulled up to it, the beams and structure would begin to break apart. The guide on the tram would build up anticipation by stating that they would be fine if they drove over quickly, but once the entirety of the tram was on the structure, a separate piece from the moving bridge supports would fall, startling riders for a fun gag. 1975 saw many additions to the tram tour, which at the Entertainment Center, as the upper lot was now called, included additional stunts for the stunt show, and a new outdoor theater was built for an attraction known as the Show of 1,000 Faces. This 20-minute production involved bringing up participants who would sit in a makeup chair and be transformed into Frankenstein's monster and a new version of his bride. As this occurred, the show would explain information about the history and process of movie makeup, and once the participants were ready, they participated in a skit where the show host, dressed up as a mad doctor, placed them into what he called the Eternal Life Cabinet. Flipping a switch and simulating an electric shock, a simple magic trick reveals the charred skeletons of the people who entered, which concluded the show. For the actual tram portion this year, it got two big additions. The first was the runaway train, where, after moving through the western sets, a steam locomotive would barrel right towards the tram. The other attraction was the Doomed Glacier Expedition, based on the film The Eiger Sanction, which was released the same year. As the tram entered the ice tunnel, and riders heard sound effects of howling wind, the tunnel around the trams would begin to spin, creating a disorienting experience as if it was collapsing. With the introduction of the flash flood, the glamour trams really evolved into something beyond just a tour of the studio, putting riders into thrilling situations as if they were really riding through the movies. While all of these set pieces were inspired by certain films, or just special effects in general, they all were a bit generic, and didn't reference anything in particular. This changed in 1976, when the Tram Tour introduced Jaws Attack, and if you know anything about the Tram Tour, you'll certainly recognize that this segment is obviously based on Jaws, the 1975 Spielberg film that created the idea of the summer blockbuster. As the tram drove into a recreation of Amity Island, riders witnessed a shark fin approach a fisherman. In a brutal attack, he and his boat are pulled into the water, and underwater pumps churn the surface, which is mixed with red dye to simulate blood. The bridge that the tram is parked on leads into the water as the dock is pulled away, and as the tram begins to move forward, the shark suddenly surfaces, attacking riders on the vehicle. Yes, this first version of the shark did look quite goofy with its awkward mechanical movements and massive teeth, but I'm sure that for the time, this was actually quite thrilling for people on the tour. In 1977, the Upper Lot debuted another show called the Screen Test Theater, which put visitors into the role of actors and extras as scenes were shot for a faux episode of the television series Emergency. At the end, the scenes would be spliced together and shown to the audience. For the Tram Tour this year, it added a stop in the front lot where riders would enter Soundstage 32 and sit down for a show called the $6 Million Man/Bionic Woman Testing Center. Essentially, this was a special effects showcase using characters from their respective television series, with the show demonstrating how studio magic created these superhuman feats. The following year, the Screen Test Theater became the Screen Test Comedy Theater and replaced Emergency with sets based on the movie Airport 77. Despite simulating a plane crash in the water and a rescue mission, I think that it was framed as comedic because people thought it was funny to see themselves and their families participating in these roles. In 1979, the Tram Tour replaced the rock slide with Battle of Galactica, based of course on Battlestar Galactica. As the tour drove up to a building dressed as the facade of a ship, a Cylon declares that the studio visitors have been taken prisoner and demands that they board the vessel. The tram guide gives resistance, which results in the Cylon firing a weapon with a steam effect, and moving inside the battleship, the tram stops and a scene plays out, with the robots and aliens beginning an interrogation. This scene actually has a lot of really great animated figures, and as the ship prepares to take off with the prisoners for their extermination, a live actor bursts into the set and begins firing. Robots break apart, the aliens retreat, and smoke effects simulate blaster shots flying around the ship, resulting in an attraction that feels forgotten by many people, but actually had outstanding production value for something outside of Disney at the time. Speaking of outstanding production value, 1980 saw the opening of Castle Dracula in the Castle Theater at the Entertainment Center, which, inspired by the success of the Show of a Thousand Faces, erected an indoor theater in its place. There's very little documentation of what this attraction really involved, but I do know that two guests were taken and dressed up in makeup to look like Frankenstein's monster and the bride right before the show. The actual show itself featured an animatronic Phantom of the Opera, who I believe introduces the production, and the volunteers in monster makeup are brought out on stage by Dr. Frankenstein, who sits them at a dining table for the duration of the show. What I believe occurs is that Frankenstein is searching for Dracula, which at one point results in a startling werewolf animatronic popping out from a coffin, but Dracula does eventually reveal himself and summons his brides as the villain of the show. In a shocking twist, Dracula is defeated by none other than, and you're never gonna guess it, the Incredible Hulk. Yeah, this show seemed awesome, even though I have no idea what it was meant to be other than a showcase of movie makeup. But at least it's a really interesting evolution of that original concept, starting with the makeup demonstration in the basement of the studio commissary back in 1964. However, Castle Dracula is the very last major attraction of the Glamour Trams era, and that brings us into a new chapter of the Universal Tram Tour. In 1983, the Glamour Trams were replaced with the new and updated Super Trams, which, designed by Winnebago, could accommodate even more people as demand for the tour continued to grow. While not as flashy as the Glamour Trams, the new blue and gray color scheme of the Super Trams has, I think, become iconic to the tour. And before we want to move on, there are a few changes made to the upper lot that are worth noting. Unfortunately, the dates seem to be lost for when exactly these debuted, but between 1978 and 1980, the Screen Test Comedy Theater was updated to include a larger variety of scenes not tied to an intellectual property, which had guest starring in a western and a collection of other unrelated individual comedic scenes. Somewhere during this time frame, the upper lot also introduced the Motion Picture and Television Museum, which, while not the most exciting attraction on offer, is at least worth noting for its collection of film props and costumes. In 1980, the stunt show was reworked into the iconic Wild 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 West stunt show, which took what it was before and expanded on the set with even more additional stunts and effects. On the tram tour, the stop at Soundstage 32 changed into a new exhibition known as just the Special Effects Stage. This version showcased a variety of effects, starting in the 1930s and showing how a miniature was used for Buck Rogers' spaceship. There was also a segment on stop-motion animation with articulated dinosaur models, a trick room where one actor stands sideways on a wall, and a miniature model of a fairground, demonstrating how effects were achieved for Steven Spielberg's recent film, 1941. Although not documented very well, the special effects stage had other show elements, but I also couldn't find a date for its premiere either, with it debuting somewhere between 1979 and 1984. Moving back into the Supertrams era though, in 1983, Castle Dracula was replaced after only a 3-year run. The Castle Theater now hosted The Adventures of Conan Sword and Sorcery Spectacular, based on the previous year's film, Conan the Barbarian. Combining stunt work with special effects like pyrotechnics and lasers, this looked extremely innovative for its time, and you can really see how the show established the DNA for later Universal special effects stunt shows like Terminator 2 3D, The Eighth Voyage of Sinbad, and Poseidon's Fury. Also worth noting is the gigantic animated figure of a dragon, which could shoot lasers from its eyes and even breathe fire. No mechanical figure of this size and complexity had ever existed before, and the incredible production value of the show was stunning for its time. This also seems to be a show that goes forgotten by Universal fans, but it's a big milestone in their attraction development. The following year, 1984, another show would premiere at the Entertainment Center with the A-Team live-action stunt show, which was another notable milestone for Universal because of how it incorporated vehicles into the stunt work. However, the next brand new and exciting addition to the Supertrams came in 1986. After the tour drove through New York Street, the tram guide would announce that they were entering an indoor New York set inside of a soundstage, but on moving inside, visitors found wide-scale destruction. As the tram drives onto the Brooklyn Bridge, a news report begins to play on the screens of the tram cars, reporting how an enraged beast is on the loose, and it cuts to a reporter in a helicopter who, in a panic, screams that there's a tram right in the path of danger. Your tram, in fact. The screen cuts out as the helicopter crashes into the set, and all of a sudden, the tram is confronted by a 30-foot tall animated figure of King Kong. A police helicopter fires at the beast, only enraging it, and causing the bridge to shake violently as he attempts to get to riders in the tram. An amusing effect during this scene was the banana scent emitting from his breath, but as the helicopter begins firing again, it distracts Kong long enough for the tram to pull forward and make its escape. Along with the ambitious Conan Spectacular, people were really taking notice of how Universal was building attractions that rivaled what was down south in Anaheim at Disneyland, and the King Kong encounter was a big step in pushing Universal in a more ambitious direction. Leaving that thought in the back of your mind for now though, 1987 saw the replacement of the A-Team show with the Miami Vice Action Spectacular, building an arena with water, 4 bombastic watercraft vehicle chases and explosions. This is another lesser known show that was quite spectacular, and I actually already covered it in its own video if you want to learn more. In 1988, the Screen Test Comedy Theater was converted into the Star Trek Adventure, which recycled the concept of filming guests to create a movie, but this time it was obviously a Star Trek film. The same year, another important attraction came to the Super Trams, where as riders entered Soundstage 50, they found themselves in an underground train tunnel in San Francisco. To their surprise, the tram began to rock violently as they found themselves experiencing an earthquake that registers as an 8.3 on the Richter scale. The station also began to shake apart as sparks shot down from wires on the ceiling, and as the earthquake continues to get more intense, the roof caves in, revealing the outside street as a gasoline tanker truck slides down and hits a pole in the station. It leaks fuel, and the sparks from a downed power line set it on fire, causing an explosion right alongside the tram. As the earthquake continues, a train is heard coming down another tunnel, and as it enters the station, it derails and crashes right alongside riders in what is a very impressive technical effect. For the finale, 60,000 gallons of water begins rushing into the station for another flash flood effect, which concludes the segment as the tram drives forward. Known as Earthquake the Big One, this set piece is capable of resetting in just 15 seconds, making this a thrilling mechanical marvel that's still a highlight of the tour today. By this point, it's clear that Universal was evolving into something more than just a simple tour of the movie studio, like it was intended to be a few decades prior, really coming into its own as a thrilling themed experience with high-quality shows at the entertainment center and stunning set pieces along the tram tour. If you're a big Universal fan, then I think you know what's coming next. In 1990, Universal opened its first theme park, Universal Studios Florida in Orlando. If you've been watching my channel for a long time, you know that I've covered this story before, but essentially, when Universal expressed interest in opening another functioning studio in Florida with an accompanying tram tour, Disney attempted to shut them out by opening their own studio park, which became Disney MGM Studios in 1989. Along with collaborating with Steven Spielberg as a creative consultant to help design attractions for the new park, it was set pieces on the tram tour like the King Kong encounter and the then in development Earthquake that gave Universal the confidence to move forward and establish themselves in the theme park space. However, Disney essentially plagiarized a large part of Universal's plans for their early Florida studio concept, as the CEO of Disney at the time, Michael Eisner, had been privy to those early plans as the previous president of Paramount when Universal was shopping around for studio partners on the early project. This forced Universal to reconsider their original studio concept and pivot towards a theme park instead. And while it did function as an actual film studio, the attractions became the main focus. Earthquake became a lengthy experience, with the actual ride preceded by multiple theaters where park visitors were taught about special effects and disaster films. The King Kong encounter became Confrontation, a wildly ambitious ride where you encounter the monster not once, but twice, in a thrilling escape from New York City. Jaws Attack was also turned into a thrilling action ride, where as you boated through the water around Amity Island, you were attacked by the shark again and again, with the ride erupting into fiery chaos. Or at least, that was the plan, as the ride had severe technical issues, and after extended closures, was completely reworked a few years later. Along with the opening park came ambitious shows that were original only to Florida, as well as the E.T. Adventure as a brand new attraction, which was developed with the help of Spielberg. This was then followed in 1991 by Back to the Future the Ride, which was also another Spielberg attraction. With Universal Studios Florida opening as Universal's first true theme park with an emphasis on the attractions rather than actual film production, even though that did still occur there, it changed the course of Universal Hollywood as well. Since 1964, the Tram Tour was the main attraction for visitors at the original studio, and the other early demonstrations like the makeup and stunt shows were more just supplemental and part of the larger experience. However, while I think it could be argued that Castle Dracula in 1980 could have been the first step away from this, or perhaps The Adventures of Conan in 1983, as both shows were ambitious enough to stand out as attractions that were more than just supplemental to the Tram Tour, I think that it was in 1991 with the opening of the E.T. Adventure that solidified Universal Hollywood's transformation into an actual theme park, with the Tram Tour becoming another major attraction rather than the main focus. This shift was further reinforced with the 1992 opening of Backdraft, which replaced the Burning House, the 1993 premiere of Back to the Future the Ride, replacing Battle of Galactica, and the ambitious 1996 Jurassic Park the Ride, among other additions that would continue to be built. Without the Tram Tour evolving to include ambitious set pieces, all of which started with the Flash Flood, there would be no Universal Studios Florida. But with no Universal Studios Florida, Hollywood probably wouldn't have evolved into the theme park that it is today. So from this point forward, I'm not going to cover the development of anything outside of the Tram Tour, because this new theme park was forging its own identity outside of its original defining attraction. As the theme park side of Universal Hollywood developed throughout the 90s, the Supertrams did not get a lot of focus, which I think is actually understandable, as Jaws, King Kong, and Earthquake, among everything else offered by the attraction, were still enough to keep it pretty fresh in the eyes of visitors. I think it's worth noting that in 1995, Universal opened Fire Station 51, which is named after the fire station from Emergency. It's not an attraction. In fact, it's an actual functioning fire station as part of the municipality of Universal City, but it's highlighted as part of the Tram Tour today, so I think it's worth mentioning. In 1997, the doomed Glacier Expedition was rethemed to Dante's Peak, a volcano disaster film that premiered the same year. While the ice was removed from the rockwork, and a smoke effect was placed along the tunnel to simulate the idea of heat coming from a volcano shaft, which doesn't really even make sense when you think about it, the experience was otherwise mostly the same. The next update to the tour actually ends the Supertrams era, as the vehicles were replaced with a new model that keeps the same colors, but has a sleeker design and updates the overhead television screens. The StudioTour.com designates this as the Modern Trams, but I don't think that's an official name. In 2001, the Dante's Peak volcano was rethemed yet again to an attraction known as the Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, based on the 1999 reboot of The Mummy. As the tram pulled up to the now Egyptian-themed studio set, the tram guide would comment that Whoopi Goldberg had been seen filming around the lot recently, but had disappeared. After passing through some scenes of Egyptian sets indoors, the curse would be invoked, causing the tunnel to spin around the tram. At its conclusion, Whoopi Goldberg would appear on the screen as if discovered by the people on the tour, but was then quickly consumed by flesh-eating scarabs. Jumping 6 years forward to 2005, the tram would begin driving through the crashed Boeing 747 set from Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds. I haven't really highlighted too many sets throughout the video, but this one is impressive enough that I think it's definitely considered its own distinct attraction. In 2006, the tour got a few small additions, including the Picture Cars, a collection of iconic vehicles used in Universal films. New vehicles were always being added and removed from this area, so it was dynamic and added a bit of variety to the tour. With the Picture Cars also came a Jurassic Park segment, where tourists would encounter props and a static T-Rex from the film franchise. However, as the tram continued to drive through, Visitors would react as animatronic Dilophosaurs squirted water at the tram as if spitting acid, and finally would encounter a static Spinosaurus. The final addition to the tour this year was the debut of Fast and Furious Extreme Close-Up, where as the tram entered stage 55, which was dressed up to look like the streets of Tokyo, it would stop and watch an action sequence that took place around two cars. An effect called the bullet hit was achieved through jets in the ground, which was then followed by a demonstration of smoke and fire effects. After being demonstrated, these were brought together in an action scene, where a stray bullet causes an explosion and the cars go flying right at the tram, revealing that they're mounted on hidden Kuka arms. The tram guide introduces the cars as Carnage and Karma, and asks them to take a bow as they're tilted forward. Then, for the next 40 seconds, the cars begin to dance to Daddy Yankee's Gasolina, in what is one of the strangest additions ever made to the tram tour. In 2008, a fire broke out and destroyed a large part of New York Street, which, unfortunately, also led to the permanent closure and demolition of the King Kong encounter. To replace this segment, Universal brought this iconic creature back in a new building, hosting an experience known as King Kong 360 3D, based on the 2005 Peter Jackson remake of the film. After entering a crumbling ruin on Skull Island, the tram parks in a motion base in a dark tunnel as tribal drums begin to echo around the chamber. As the screen fades in, the tram is moved up and down in conjunction with wind effects to simulate the tram driving through the jungle, encountering the fictional Ventosaurus raptors that run alongside the tram. Emerging out into a clearing, a handful of V-Rexes attack the raptors but quickly notice the tram, trying to get to riders by slamming into the vehicle. Suddenly, Kong emerges from the jungle on the right side and begins to fight one of them, then jumping over the tram to attack the others. As he jumps back over to the right side again, the screen makes it appear as if a V-Rex grabs onto the back of the tram, which pulls everyone down as they begin to slide off of a cliff. The tram falls and gets caught in swinging vines, but as Kong jumps down and continues to fight, the tram begins to fall, which results in Kong jumping down and catching the vehicle and ending the segment. While this doesn't live up to the King Kong encounter that it replaced, I think it's a decently fun segment that highlights Peter Jackson's CGI from the film, and is a nice addition to the tram tour as part of the larger experience. In 2013, the Fast and Furious Extreme Close-Up stopped operating, and the closure and demolition of the Curse of the Mummy's tomb began. In 2015, its replacement opened as the infamous Fast and Furious Supercharged, with the tram being addressed on the overhead screens by US Special Agent Luke Hobbs, stating that there's a key witness on board who can help them in their criminal investigation of Owen Shaw, the villain of Fast and Furious 6. The tram drives into a garage to hide the witness, and after parking, Roman and Letty appear on screen, asking riders to turn off their cell phones so that they can't be tracked. Moving forward, it's revealed that this garage is the location of a loud and ironically conspicuous party, which is quickly interrupted by the FBI. Roman comes out and is confronted by an agent who attempts to arrest him, but is backed up by Dom and Letty as a truck rises out of the garage floor. Hobbs comes in to reinforce them, and as the agent is escorted away, Roman takes a call, blowing the operation and revealing your location to Owen Shaw. Dom instructs the tram driver to move forward, and moving into the next scene, the tram enters a screen tunnel, similar to the one used for the new King Kong. Tram riders now find themselves in the basement's level of the Jurassic parking garage, and quickly encountering Owen Shaw, who threatens the tram to hand over the witness. The Fast and Furious crew shows up, causing the tram to peel off and crash through the garage and out into the streets of LA. As chaos erupts around the tram, and Owen Shaw and his thugs are being fought off, the tram merges onto the highway where even more chaos occurs. After Dom grabs onto a helicopter drone and muscles it into some sort of explosive plant, the other vehicles throw hooks into the tram and hit the NOS, escaping the explosion and jumping over a ramp, with the tram coming down and crashing into a soundstage, saving the witness. After the premiere of Fast and Furious Supercharged, it would be another 7 years before the next major addition came to the tram tour, with 2022 debuting the set of Jupiter's Claim from Jordan Peele's Nope. Driving through this little western theme park with inflatable waving tube men, the site begins to lose power and the lights flicker as audio effects convey that the UFO is flying right over the tram. The scene is not very complex and is mostly audio, but it's treated like an attraction by the park, and finally concludes the history of the tram tour, as it is the most recent addition. Like I said at the beginning of the video, the history of the Universal Tram Tour is long, complex, and not very thoroughly documented, and so I tried to present its history with the broader strokes of its development. For example, I could have spent time documenting the evolution of changes to the Jaws scene, or highlighting the different sets and smaller attractions that came and went from the tour, but I think that would have ended up becoming quite tedious. It lacks the documentation really needed to really get into the details. There are also attractions that came and went at the Visitors Entertainment Center that have almost no information available about them. For example, this park map from 1970 shows Ark Park, which I think was a petting zoo that evolved from the Ma and Pa Kettle Farm, or the Puppet Show, which I can find no information about at all. The tram tour is dynamic and always changing, and so I think it's natural that a lot of information has been lost. But even so, I tried my best to put together the most comprehensive timeline that I can, sifting through an overwhelming amount of information and promotional material to bring you what I think is probably the most comprehensive video on the history of the tour. However, I think it would also be helpful to go through the tour as it is right now from a most recent experience in September of 2025, really illustrating how often changes can really affect the experience. The tram station is currently located on the upper lot of the park, and after leaving and passing by the back of the Simpsons ride, the tram begins to descend downhill through Timeline Drive. I cannot find a date for when this was installed on the tour, but as you wind down the side of the mountain, a timeline of framed movie posters on both sides of the tram chronicles the release of Universal's most iconic films. On the right, the timeline is interrupted by Fire Station 51, which the tram guide always points out as part of the studio functioning like a city. And coming to the end of the descent and passing by the back of Jurassic World the Ride, you now find yourself moving through the front lot. Here, you pass by sound stages with a lot of filming history in them, and sometimes you'll even encounter an open door where you might catch a glimpse of production. As you pass through this area and make a right, your guide will highlight films and shows produced here, both in the past and currently filming, which means that the information is constantly changing. Eventually, you'll pass by a statue of Ted, who stands in front of the bungalows, and the guide usually talks about how Unit 5195 was formerly inhabited by Alfred Hitchcock, presenting a bit of information about the films he produced for Universal. I believe that in the early days of the tour, visitors would get out and explore some of these, with one of them hosting Doris Day's dressing room. After passing by more sound stages and production offices, the tram finally makes it to the metro sets, which, depending on the day you're there, may or may not be closed off for filming. If available, you loop through the sets as the guide discusses famous films shot there, with I think the most iconic being Hill Valley from Back to the Future, which has been a regular part of the tour since 1985. Looping out of the metro sets, the tram ascends a small hill, where before entering King Kong 363D, you can see the remnants of the collapsing bridge with the now stationary runaway train sitting on top. Unfortunately, in April of 2024, an accident occurred where a tram hit a guardrail, resulting in minor injuries for some of the riders, and since that time, after exiting the Kong experience, the trams no longer drive up the hill, bypassing the picture cars, the Jurassic Park attraction, and the Flash Flood, illustrating how the tram tour can change on the fly. For now, the trams circle back and move around the outside of the metro sets, then either passing through or around an area called 6 points, depending on whether there is active filming or not. These western sets, all of which have extensive filming history behind them, are called 6 points because if you stand where they converge, you can look in 6 different directions for a variety of filming angles and locations. Moving out of this area, the trams next pass by Park Lake, where you might recall that the Torpedo Run and the Parting of the Red Sea used to be. The tram then proceeds through Little Europe, which is a rebuild of much older sets that burned down in 1967, but had a lot of history, being used for some of Universal's monster films and the 1930 adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front. This new Little Europe still has an extensive history of film production of its own though, as the tour will point out, and emerging from the sets, the tram drives into Soundstage 50 to experience Earthquake, which recently got a massive refurbishment in 2023. On exiting the stage and moving around the outside of the western sets, the tram next passes into Amity Island, which also just received an extensive refurbishment in 2024 for a refreshed, thrilling encounter with the iconic shark. After concluding this segment and winding up the hill, the tram passes by iconic house facades on Elm Street that the tram guide provides exposition about. And again, if you're lucky and there's no filming, the tram will then turn left onto Colonial Street. Here, you experience an artificial suburb featuring many iconic houses, with the tour often highlighting how it was used for filming for productions like The Burbs and Desperate Housewives. On circling through the cul-de-sac and exiting the street, the tram continues moving uphill. Pulling up and to the left, the picture car exhibit has been moved to this area of the backlot, and passing by the Bates Motel, which depending on the time of the year may or may not be dressed up for Halloween Horror Nights, you might encounter an actor playing Norman Bates who will step out with a knife and approach the tram, which I believe started in 2008. At other times, as you proceed up the hill and past the Bates Mansion, you might encounter Norman here instead. The tram then drives through the set from War of the Worlds and then through Jupiter's Claim. Until March of 2025, this is the point where the tram would experience Fast and Furious Supercharged. But because the park is building the fantastic-looking Fast and Furious Hollywood Drift coaster, Universal chose to close this widely panned portion of the tour. Because you now skip by Supercharged, you conclude the 45-minute tram experience by passing by Falls Lake, a versatile filming location used for water scenes and framed by a large blue screen. Perhaps it's a bit of an anticlimactic finish for the current iteration of the tram tour, but there is a lot of film history here, and very much reinforces how the tour continues to change and adapt, as you never really know what you're going to see. I don't think that I can really talk about the history of the tram tour without at least briefly mentioning the Terror Tram, which debuted at Universal's first Halloween Horror Nights in 1986. As far as I can determine, the event was small and only consisted of the Terror Tram, where scare actors would hide in the backlot and run at the tram to scare visitors. Unfortunately, one actor got too close and passed away after getting crushed between two of the cars, bringing an end to the event until much later. While it was then revived for Universal Studios Florida in 1991, it was initially known as Fright Nights in its first year. It took until 1992 to resume in Hollywood, featuring 2 scare mazes, plenty of themed shows, and the return of the Terror Tram. There's not really any information describing what this version of it entailed, but I believe that the scare actors were no longer directly interacting with the moving vehicle, instead dropping people off in the backlot to view a stationary tram with actors on it as one facet of a larger tour. Throughout the history of the event, the Terror Tram would come and go, but today, it takes people to the backlot and drops them off at the Bates Motel, sending everyone through a series of what I would describe as outdoor scare mazes among the sets for a really unique haunt experience. To finally wrap up the video, I want to also briefly talk about the production tour, which opened with Universal Studios Florida as their version of the tram tour, and is probably one of the most ill-conceived Universal attractions to ever exist. Boarding near Nickelodeon Studios, the tour first took park guests behind the sound stages, where they were told about the film production process, which, as you can imagine, just doesn't resonate the same when this is a brand new studio park that has barely actually shot anything. The tramps would then enter the park through Production Central and pass through the Boneyard, a display that featured massive movie props and vehicles that really felt like it was there just to fill up space since the park was so new. From here, the tram route could change depending on whether filming was occurring in the park, but usually would first drive through New York, traveling alongside the lagoon, would then loop back through Hollywood, and then return back to the loading area bypassing the other side of the boneyard. While I think it's amusing that the tram just drove in guest pathways where people were walking, it just didn't last very long because it wasn't even a real tour of anything, even though the park did have some light production happening in its earliest years. The production tour closed in 1995 for obvious reasons, but you know what? I think it would actually make sense for it to return. Universal has clearly realized that the direction that it took with Universal Studios Florida was not great, replacing its original ambitious lineup with screen-based dark rides. People still pine for the iconic classic lineup of Confrontation, Earthquake, and Jaws, and bringing back the tram tour actually seems like the perfect solution to this. If you haven't stayed up to date on the park, Kid Zone was replaced with DreamWorks Land in 2024. It was clearly done on a shoestring budget. A budget that I hope was small enough that Universal doesn't have any reservations about eventually replacing this area with something else. It's the perfect location for the entrance to another tram tour, flanked by classic Universal attractions like Animal Actors on the left, the E.T. Adventure on the right, and the horror makeup show not too far off in the park either. By tearing out DreamWorks Land for queue space and a station, it would allow Universal to create a tram tour focused on big set pieces back in the area where they currently host tents for Halloween Horror Nights houses. If you look at the space from an aerial perspective, it would require moving around some infrastructure, but if they got creative with space, they could design a tram route that goes into different buildings back here, all of which host iconic Universal scenes, getting you up close and personal with King Kong in New York City, or riding out a San Francisco earthquake. These buildings could also be large enough to function as dedicated indoor space for Halloween Horror Nights as well, really getting creative with the limited space in the park. Because the trams are flexible where they can go, it means that if space opens up in the park elsewhere, other individual attractions for the tram could open if needed, like for example replacing the Fear Factor stage with something like the Hollywood Jaws segment, which could also be visible from the park pathway and would add great kinetic action. I also think that the Jurassic Park River Adventure at Islands of Adventure is in desperate need of an overhaul, and while I see that a notably extensive refurbishment is currently on its schedule, I still think that it would benefit from the Jurassic World treatment that Hollywood got. If that's the case, the new Studio Tram Tour could have its own unique Jurassic Park segment, and could include other attractions based on classic properties like Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, or perhaps even a segment from Psycho. An attraction like this wouldn't be easy to create and would be quite expensive, but I think it could plausibly work if an effort was made to use space creatively, and judging from how hard Universal has been leaning into the classic merchandise, and with these properties showing up in the tribute stores, Halloween Horror Nights, the Mega Movie Parade, and its newest nighttime spectacular, Sensational, it's clear that something like this would be immensely successful. The Studio Tram Tour has proven to be the DNA from which Universal evolved into the theme park giant that it is today, starting from the glamour trams and humble demonstrations to aid the studio commissary, to growing its attractions with big set pieces that just continue to become increasingly ambitious. These proved to Universal that they could stand on their own in the theme park space, and looking at them now, they are, in many aspects, leading the industry from a creative perspective. Hopefully, this comprehensive look at the history of the Universal Tram Tour provided interesting insight into the growth and development of Universal, not just as a studio, but as an entertainment destination. Without the Tram Tour, there is no Universal Studios Florida, and without that, Universal could not have grown into the success that it is today. If you enjoyed this video and want to support it as the definitive history of the Universal Tram Tour, please leave a like if you haven't already, as this took a lot of time to research and assemble. As always, if you haven't yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can also do so now to be alerted to new videos as they're released.